I just had the Zoom, your internet is unstable sign, which I, of course, do not want to happen.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Well, welcome everyone, whether you're watching us live or whether you're watching us on catch up. It's a great pleasure today to have Naomi Weiss to give a APGRD talk. I first met her back when she was still at Somerville here in Oxford. We talked about your graduate work, I remember. And then a couple of years ago, last saw her live a couple of years ago when we agreed that she really must give an APGRD talk. So in between those two times, she went to Berkeley, did her doctorate at Berkeley on musica in the broadest sense of the word, particularly song and dance, and particularly in tragedy, particularly in Euripides. And some of that turned into the book Music, the Music of Tragedy, Performance and Imagination in Euripidean Theatre that came out in 2018. She's now working on audience experience, the aesthetics of audience experience and tragedy, and is at Harvard, where she is the Gardner Cowles Associate Professor of the Humanities. And today, I think, am I right, Naomi, this is the first time you've reached out into modern reception to talk about tragic form in Kamila Shamsie's 2017 novel Home Fire, a very powerful and unsettling novel. So greetings, Naomi, even though at a distance, and we're delighted to have you talking to us today.
Thank you so much, Oliver, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in to listen. It's lovely to have that introduction and wonderful to be part of this community with, as you say, my very first foray into reception studies. If you just bear with me while I share my screen. Okay. It seems easy to set fiction and theatre against each other, to juxtapose realism and theatricality, private reading and public theatre going, print and performance. But the novel's borrowings for drama go all to the genre's beginnings 2,000 years ago, when Greek writers like Heliodorus integrated tragedy and comedy within their prose tales of travel and romance, and all the way forward into contemporary fiction. In the last couple of decades, there's been a spate of retellings of Shakespeare in novels published in the UK and the US, led by the Hogarth Shakespeare Initiative. There have also been numerous novelistic adaptations in English of ancient Greek stories, taken especially from epic, but also from tragedy. 2007 alone saw the publication of Colm Toibín's House of Names, the Oresteia, David Vann's Bright Air Black, Medea, Natalie Haynes's The Children of Jocasta, a mix of Oedipus Tyrannus and Antigone, and Kamila Shamsie's Home Fire, Antigone. Among these recent tragic retellings, Shamsie's is unusual in the extent to which it draws ancient play behind it, despite, unlike the others you see here on the screen, being set in the modern day. This novel doesn't just rework the story of Antigone, but is constructed around the dramatic form of Sophocles' tragedy. It is, in quite a fundamental sense, a play-turned-novel. Kamila Shamsie is a very successful Pakistani-British novelist and non-fiction writer. She's published 7 novels since 1998. Home Fire, her 7th, was received with much critical acclaim in both the US and the UK, where it won the 2018 Women's Prize for Fiction. Originally, the theatre director Jatinder Verma challenged her to write a play, as she has said, something like Antigone in an Asian or British Asian context. Shamsie has claimed, "I pretended to myself I was thinking of a play, but really all along I thought, oh, here's my next novel." The result is a multimedia text full of theatrical traces, a literary archive that preserves the dramatic quality of Sophocles' play, but also encompasses various forms of media elements. Theatrical productions, TV dramas and news programs, social media, poetry, even pop songs. This talk, I'll first provide more of an introduction to Homefire and demonstrate some of the basic contours of its Antigone plot. I'll also talk about some of Shamsie's intertexts across various media, other versions of Antigone, and other examinations of British Muslims' relationship with the British state from the last 2 decades. The novel's intermediality will lead me then to focus on its theatrical engagement with Sophocles' play, specifically in terms of how it reworks some of the tragedy's formal elements, its structural features. I'll close by briefly suggesting how such manipulation of tragic form contributes to Homefire's political import. Antigone, more than any other surviving tragedy, has a rich history of politically resonant adaptations, from Jean Anouilh's Antigone to Athol Fugard's The Island to Theatre of War's Antigone and Ferguson. Such plays have often used Sophocles' tragedy to explore ways for the oppressed and the powerless to publicly counter their powerful oppressors. Homefire, as a novel focused on Muslim identity, Islamophobia, and citizenship rights in contemporary Britain, fits within this tradition of Antigone's theatrical adaptations. I hope to show that it does so in part through its multimedia theatricality, for this facilitates in Homefire something that Greek tragedy itself, especially Antigone, produced. That is a contestation of multiple voices, a polyphony for its reader or its audience to hear, to critique, to put against their own. Homefire is not Shamsie's first experiment with integrating ancient Greek texts into her fiction. Perhaps unsurprising for a writer whose grandfather apparently read her Homer in Greek when she was a toddler, her earlier novels contain numerous allusions to Greek myth and literature amid a really dazzling array of intertexts, from the Quran to T.S. Eliot to the exile poetry of Faiz Ahmad Faiz. A God in Every Stone, published 3 years before Homefire, opens with an epigraph from Herodotus. And indeed, that sets the entire plot off. In Shamsie's second novel, Salt and Saffron from 2000, Aliyah and her not quite twin, Samir, remember her family used to explain their relationship through the Greek story of Leda's twin eggs, one from Tyndareus and the other from Zeus. When Aliyah dismisses it as mythology from a cultural tradition not our own, Samir points to the rich transcontinental cultural interactions that are really a hallmark of all Shamsie's fiction. She says, actually, ancient Greek texts were kept alive through Arab translations. But Homefire is distinct from this earlier work by actually being modeled on an ancient Greek text. And here's, for those of you who need it, a quick reminder of Sophocles' play about Oedipus's family. So in the aftermath of Polynices attacking his own city of Thebes, resulting in the mutual slaughter of him and his brother Eteocles, their uncle Creon is now king. Son Haemon is engaged to Antigone, sister of Polynices. Creon has ordered Polynices' body to be left unburied as punishment outside the city. But Antigone buries him, despite her sister Ismene trying to stop her. As punishment, Creon has Antigone locked up in a cave. He has second after the seer Tiresias intervenes, but it's too late. Antigone has hung herself when Creon and his men find Haemon, who then kills himself over Antigone's body. Creon's wife also commits suicide, and the play ends with the king's wretched mourning. This tragedy is still one of the most widely performed surviving Greek drama. It's also the most extensively discussed across many disciplines, classics, of course, but political science, psychoanalysis, gender studies. Now, Homefire set in 2015, revolves around the families of two British Muslims of Pakistani heritage, Adil Pasha, a jihadi killed years earlier on his way to Guantanamo, and Karamat Lone, the British Home Secretary. And just as a warning here, I hope you've read the novel already because spoilers alert. Polynices is Parvez, a 19-year-old recruited by the Islamic State to work in their media division in Syria. The story's 5 narratives or acts, each focusing on a different character. It begins with Isma, Adil's daughter, who has recently arrived in Massachusetts to pursue postgraduate study after years of her younger siblings, Parvez, and his sister Anika. Isma soon meets Amon, Karamat's son, whose mother, Terry, is Irish American. Their encounter results in Amon in the next act meeting Anika, a law student back in London. Amon and Anika soon embark on an intense sexual relationship. He later discovers that she has, though, an ulterior motive to secure his assistance as the Home Secretary's son in getting Parvez back to the UK. Amon, besotted with Anika, goes to his father for help, unsuccessfully. The narrative then shifts in the next act to Parvez. We learn of the process of his recruitment or entrapment by ISIS. He desperately wants to come home and he gets in touch with Anika to form a plan, but he's killed as he makes his way to the British consulate. Anika's act comes next, followed by Karamat. On his first day as Home Secretary, Karamat revoked the citizenship of all dual nationals who have left Britain to join our enemies. Now he applies this law even to Parvez's dead body, which must be repatriated to Pakistan instead. Anika then travels to Karachi and sits by her brother's corpse, which has been covered with ice, outside the British Deputy High Commission. Amon goes, but as he approaches, 2 men fasten a suicide vest on him, and the novel ends with his and Anika's final embrace. Now, though it stretches from London to Massachusetts, Syria, Turkey, Karachi, this novel actually doesn't feature the sort of really large-scale transcontinental cross-generational interaction common to much of Shamsie's previous work. Gardner has characters from Turkey, Britain, and pre-partition India. Burnt Shadows from 2009, perhaps her other best-known novel, moves with a multinational cast from Nagasaki to Delhi, to Karachi, to New York, to Afghanistan. In contrast, Home Fire's 5 protagonists are all British and all of Muslim Pakistani descent, though with different degrees of identification with Islam. Antigone concerns the city of Thebes. Home Fire primarily concerns London, where Shamsie herself now lives. The city's urban fabric really weaves its way through much of the narrative. The story's chronological scope, like that of Antigone, is also compact than that of her earlier novels, even as there's always a strong sense, of course, in Antigone, of the weight of the past as the father on the present. The novel's political is similarly focused. Karamat, the novel's Creon, is modelled on Theresa May, Britain's anti-immigration Home Secretary from 2010 to 2016. His character also, in several respects, Sajid Javid, one of May's successors, criticised intensely for his revocation of citizenship from Shamima Begum, the ISIS bride, so-called, 2 years ago, when she, like Anika and Parvez, was just 19 years old. Karamat's actions on his first day in office, his action was to make much more use of the Nationality, Immigration, Asylum Act of 2002, whereby the British government can strip any dual national Briton, whether naturalised or British-born, of their citizenship status if, and I quote, if the Secretary of State is satisfied that the person has done anything seriously prejudicial to the vital interests of the United Kingdom or a British overseas territory. Under Theresa May, this law was expanded to include citizens without another nationality, who with their British citizenship revoked would then be stateless. Near the end of Home Fire, we learn that Karamat, against considerable opposition, is planning to expand the law similarly. He thinks it, I quote, as you see here, the sensible fulfillment of a law that was so far only half made. In this particular political focus, Shamsie draws not only from her extensive research on citizenship debates and Islamic State propaganda, as well as from her own first-hand Muslim living in both the US and Britain, but also from several previous reworkings of Sophocles' play, which become folded into her own. The novel's epigraph, "The ones we are enemies of the state," comes from Seamus Heaney's Burial at Thebes, a loose translation of Antigone commissioned for the Abbey Theatre in Dublin in 2004. Sorry, just checking my internet connection is okay. So it was commissioned in 2004. For Heaney, Antigone part represents Ireland against her colonial British oppressor. But other inspiration for him came from the Bush administration's war on terror. As Heaney writes in his notes to his translation, just as Creon forced the citizens of Thebes into an either-or situation in relation to Antigone, the Bush administration was using the same tactic to forward its argument for war on Iraq, asking in effect, are you in favor of safety or are you not? Heaney's translation echoes the Bush administration's language of terrorism. We have enemies of the state, patriots, traitors. There's one line or two lines which are, whoever isn't for us is against us. And Shamsie, in turn, echoes Heaney as Karamat, Creon, views the post-9/11 world in similar terms. But the other translation that Shamsie mentions specifically in her and repeatedly in interviews is Anne Carson's Antigone of 2015, not to be confused with her Antigonic. This Antigone combines such language of terrorism with an anti-immigrant strain, as you can see in some of the quotations I've included here. Between the translations of Heaney and Carson are at least two other versions of Antigone. One is a novel, Joydeep Roy Bhattacharya's The Watch, published in 2012, sets the story at a remote US military base in present-day Afghanistan, where a young Pashtun woman pleads with the soldiers to return her brother's body. Shamsie herself, in a review of the book for The Guardian, notes a structural feature that's actually key to her own Antigone novel. That is the series of character perspectives, a structure designed, she says, to embrace a multiplicity of voices. In the same review, she also mentions another Antigone, Polly Finley's production at the National Theatre here, which deliberately evoked the war in Afghanistan, as well as the war on terror more generally, and it interviews Finley likened Antigone to a 9/11 bomb. Home Fire's Antigone story weaves together these precedents in its focus on the sociological impact of the war on terror. That's actually what Isma, the character Isma herself, is researching. She's co-writing a paper entitled The Insecurity State, Britain and the Instrumentalization of Fear. Two other dramatic works feed into Shamsie's experimentation of this particular issue. One is Gillian Slovo's Another World, Losing Our Children to Islamic State, a play about the rise of IS and its appeal to young Europeans. This was commissioned around the same time as Home Fire and was shown at the National Theatre in 2016. It's a verbatim play, that is, it's interview-based, bringing together the testimony of young British Muslims, mothers whose children have joined the Islamic State, former Guantanamo prisoners, academics, lawyers, and soldiers. Shamsie dedicates Home Fire to Slovo And she notes in her acknowledgements how helpful it was to exchange ideas with her while they were writing, respectively, a play and a novel on a similar topic. The other work is Peter Kuzminski's Brits, a powerful two-part drama made for Channel 4 in 2007 about the impact of British anti-terrorism legislation on Britain's Muslim community. And I'll play it but silently for you here, this last clip of the last scene. The Muslim protagonists, whom you can see in this clip, are brother and sister. He joins MI5 while she, a medical student, becomes increasingly radicalized. The ending of Home Fire echoes the ending of Brits, when these two characters finally come together in an embrace as she, in Brits, flicks the switch of her suicide vest. Reading the last 2 pages of the novel, a description of Amon and Anika's final moments as shown on TV, I think anyone who remembers Brits has this final powerful tableau in mind, the embrace of a brother and sister in the embrace of Amon and Anika. And with this echo of Brits, lover and brother merge, just as they do at various other points in the novel, for Home Fire subtly picks up on the currents of non-normative desire that flow through Sophocles' play. It's significant, I think, that so many of the multiple overlapping models or intertexts in Shamsie's version of Antigone, a novel originally meant to be a play, are dramatic, from the stage above all, but also from the screen. At the start, I mentioned the novel's intermediality, and this is why I think it's appropriate for a talk at the Archive of Performances of Greek and Roman Drama, since it's a novel born out of theatre and performance as much as it is out of text. So now I want to go back to Shamsie's engagement with Antigone itself and with Greek tragedy as a genre. For the theatricality of this novel lies not just in its interaction with actual dramatic productions, but also in how Shamsie integrates the formal elements of Sophocles' play. And by formal elements, I mean some of tragedy's basic structural features. I'm going to focus on speech and dialogue, the agon or contest of speeches, arguments, the chorus, recognition, anagnoresis, and peripeteia, reversal, and the messenger speech. For the first of these, dialogue, I draw your attention again to what is perhaps the most obvious feature of the novel, its division into 5 acts, like dramatic acts, each from the perspective of a different character, as if each character is speaking in turn. As I mentioned, this relay race, as Shamsie herself has called it, may be influenced by the simplicity of voices in Roy Bhattacharya's The Watch. Shamsie has also experimented with shifts from one character perspective to another, sometimes converging on the one event, especially A God in Every Stone, also in Burnt Shadows. But it also evokes the dialogue form of drama, combined perhaps with the testimonial structure of Slovo's play. Even with each character having a distinct act or testimony, there is from the start a strong sense of dialogue between them, and also a sense of contrast, each character with a distinctive voice, just as in Sophocles' play. The Greek tragedy, Antigone, begins with a dialogue, as Antigone addresses Ismene, literally, "O common self-sistered head of Ismene," in a, as I say, literal, not very elegant translation. Such an emphatic declaration of sisterhood, like so much of the play's language, stresses what Mark Griffith has called the self-reflexivity of family affection, which is of course fundamental to Antigone's character and her motivation. Shamsie has said that her starting point for the novel was the centrality of siblinghood, specifically at the beginning, the relationship between Isma and Anika, Ismene and Antigone. Home Fire, like the first line of the play, begins with Isma, Ismene, and conversation with Anika, even though she's not actually directly there, quickly enters, initially in the form of a flashback sisters role-playing before Isma's interrogation at Heathrow. This sets up their difference in language and attitudes toward the state and its Islamophobic practices. So, for example, as I've included here, Anika recommends that she show at least a tiny bit of contempt and joke about the Queen. Instead, Isma says quite seriously, "I greatly admire Her Majesty's commitment to her role." Such differences set up a multivocal quality, a polyphony, that continues throughout the novel, both within immediate exchanges and from one act or narrative to the next. The contrast in style between Isma's and Anika's narratives is really striking. Anika's is divided into much shorter sections. The first is almost lyrical in its repetitions, quite unlike the more prosaic description of Isma's airport interrogation with which the novel begins. The contrast between the sisters' voices is emphasized a little later on in Anika's narrative, in a section of almost pure dialogue that reads like a script. And their exchange there also evokes the opening scene of Sophocles' play, as Anika asks for her sister's help in bringing Parves's body home, and Isma insists that they must accept the law, even when it's unjust. Between the two sisters' narratives are those of Amon and Parves. Anika's voice is always there. It always seems present through conversations with them both, Skype and text messages with Parves, and the things her voice said in Parves's audio track entitled "Twin Heard from the Garden Shed." Now, Isma largely fades away as a character once Amon's narrative begins, and increasingly the dominant contrast of voices is the one between Anika on the one hand and Amon's father, Karamat, on the other. Likewise, in Antigone, the drama revolves around the opposition of Antigone and Creon. As Anne Carson writes, they stand opposed to one another instinctually in the very morphology of their language, in the very grain of the way they think and speak. So, for example, Amon watches a clip of Karamat delivering a speech at a predominantly Muslim school in Bradford on how Muslims must abandon any outdated codes of behavior, he says, that mark them as different. Amon briefly tries to defend this in the face of Anika's fury. Their argument makes them openly acknowledge the differences between them, differences in religion, class, wealth, politics. But the underlying opposition here already seems to be the one between Anika and Karamat, channeled through his very defensive son. And this opposition underscores another formal element of tragedy reworked in the novel, the Agon, a set of opposing speeches typically divided by a few lines spoken by the chorus. Antigone and Creon's Agon scene, beginning after the guard brings her on stage, is relatively brief. That of Haimon and Creon is actually longer. In Home Fire, Amon and Karamat face each other both at the end of the son's narrative and in the father's. There's a phone conversation that includes several echoes of their exchange in Sophocles' play. Anika and Karamat, on the other hand, never actually meet, but Shamsie really captures their opposition by placing their narratives against each other, next to each other. So we have a sort of juxtaposition of worldviews, of motivations, of registers. So for example, Anika's narrative ends with her patient, steadfast, lyrical resolve to sit by her brother's corpse until the world changed or both of them crumbled into the soil around them. Karamat's then begins with his immediately more practical, frustrated concern with how an insulated coffee mug doesn't keep one's hands warm. And as he then starts considering his relationship to Britain, another voice enters, that of Terry, his wife, whom he imagines calling his plan to amend citizenship laws contemptuous. The opposing voices of Anika and Karamat also counter each other within the characters' own narratives. Within Anika's, Karamat intrudes through the TV news report about his revoking the citizenship even of a dead body, and also through a newspaper article that mentions an upcoming immigration bill that would, I quote, make it possible to strip any British passport holders of their citizenship. Within the newspaper report, there's also an opposing voice, a statement from Liberty, the human rights campaign group. And then the narrative returns to Anika. I've included a photo of this here from my own copy of the novel, just so you can see this switch. You can see even just the visual effect of moving from one perspective to another. Within Karamat's narrative as well, Anika increasingly intrudes. Already just a couple of pages in, he's thinking of her as his opponent. Soon, the narrative starts to be dominated by TV images of Anika in Karachi. At one point, their speeches actually directly counter each other, even though they are not in the same physical space. So after a dust storm, Anika faces the camera and speaks as if to Karamat himself. As you can see here, then she looked directly at the Home Secretary and spoke. In the stories of wicked tyrants, men and women are punished with exile, bodies are kept from their families, their heads impaled on spikes, their corpses thrown into unmarked graves. All these things happen according to the law, but not according to justice. The stories of wicked tyrants may be as close as the novel gets to more directly suggesting a mythical model. With the opposition of justice and law, these lines also evoke the beginning of Antigone's speech to Creon in their Agon scene in Sophocles' play. Karamat's response, like Creon's, follows almost immediately as he distorts Anika's words in his own speech in the Agon of Prime Minister's questions in Parliament. The polyphony, the multivocality of Home Fire, also manifests itself through Shamsie's transformation of the tragic chorus. Allusions to Sophocles' play become most concentrated in Anika's narrative, where the moment in the story, the immediate aftermath of her brother's death, coincides with the start of the tragic plot. This narrative act, as we've already begun to see, is also the most experimental and polyphonic, with short sections focused on Anika herself, interrupted by other voices, communicated through a variety of media. So we have TV interviews, newspaper articles, racist hashtags. I put memes here, I meant hashtags, tweets mocking the twins' neighbor Gladys after she appears on TV and is talking sympathetically of Parvez, and finally a poem. The poem comes right after a tabloid piece about the secret sex life of Pervy Pasha's twin sister, and it presents a completely different perspective on their relationship. Amon is opportunity, hope, love. Shamsie has talked about how this variety of media represents the novel's chorus. The more she thought about how fickle the chorus of Antigone is, the more, she says, she thought it's social media, it's the news. So the extracts of social media and news that interrupt Anika's narrative function like the chorus of Sophocles' play, representing the voices of the broader community, voices that can be sympathetic, but are often deeply racist, misogynistic, and sensational. Many draw directly from contemporary Islamophobic and anti-immigration rhetoric in Britain, like Theresa Home billboard campaign. The contrast of choral voices continues into Karamat's narrative, where a negative tabloid headline is followed by TV interviews with people supporting Anika, pushback that we also see in Sophocles' play as the chorus becomes more assertive against Creon. Most of these pieces of news and social media do not evoke particular choral odes from Antigone, but the tabloid article about Anika's secret sex life is, I think, perhaps reminiscent of the fourth song, or could be reminiscent of the fourth song of Antigone, a short hymn to Eros and Aphrodite. On the surface, the Eros ode seems to be about Hymen's blinding desire, but as Mark Griffith says, it's a, and I quote, one-sided interpretation that allows Sophocles to introduce Tenes. Its wedding imagery conflicts with Antigone being really determined to marry death, not Hymen, and Hymen himself has shown that he's not motivated, but is actually rebuking his father for his unjust acts. Actually, Amon's entire narrative also recalls, I think, this ode, perhaps especially Carson's rendering, where she has this great line, "You change the levels of a person's mind." But this narrative, Shamsie recalls it again and produces a similar sort of ironic effect to the original songs through the contrast juxtaposition of the tabloid and the poem, complicating any one-sided perspective. The increased integration of multiple forms of media toward the end of Home Fire is especially suggestive of the tragic chorus, but elements of its songs surface earlier in the novel as well. Oh, yeah, sorry, I'll stay here. So Parvesis's narrative is like the parados, the chorus's entrance song, looking back to explain the present plot line and constantly shifting between different moments in time. And more generally, references to music in the first half of the novel invoke, I think, the ancient Greek chorus, which would sing and dance at regular intervals in the orchestra during a dramatic performance. Such music can appear, as in tragedy, as a break before speech, like when Parves remembers how he and Anika were listening and dancing to a playlist in the kitchen before Isma told them to turn the volume down and listen. It's also part of the novel's exploration of self-identity and familial connectedness. For example, in his second encounter with Isma, Amon sings some lines of a Pakistani pop song that he remembers from when he used to visit his father's relatives. Later, he begins to learn Urdu with the help of music videos. And when Farouk starts to attract Parves towards joining the Islamic State, his story of Al Pasha involves dance as well as musical sound, as you see here. So here was Abu Parves dipping his head into a mountain stream to perform his ablutions and coming up with a beard of icicles, which led to dancing on the riverbank, as if he were Adil Pasha at a disco rather than Abu Parves in Chechnya, whose every shake of the head produced the sound of wind chimes. Of all the stories, this was the one that most clearly evoked the father he'd never known, the rushing stream, the dancing icicles, the men around him similarly braving the cold water so they could provide the jester warrior Abu Parves with an accompanying orchestra. This story's musicality plays a part in Parves's own identity formation in relation to his father, as the icicles on Adil's beard produce music and Adil's chorus of followers become an accompanying orchestra. The novel's music is also bound up with its focus throughout on sound and hearing. This motif, tied in particular to Parves, who's an aspiring audio engineer, this motif is closely connected to two more formal aspects of recognition, or to use Aristotle's term, anagnorisis, and the often related moment of reversal or peripeteia. The crucial scene of recognition and reversal in Antigone happens with the blind prophet Tiresias. After his departure, Creon, his mind disturbed, his opinion changed, attempts too late to undo his mistake. In Home Fire, there are several moments of recognition and reversal or near reversal, all linked to a sound that forces another viewpoint, another voice, a different understanding upon the listener. So the first is Isma's own icicle scene. She hears very strange music in Massachusetts. She eventually then understands its source as the acoustics of ice on ice and allows herself to feel physically the pain of losing her little brother. And in doing so, she remembers him not as ungrateful or selfish, but just as a boy obsessed with sound. The second moment of recognition and reversal is less temporary and more vital to the plot, when Parves hears the voice of a wounded woman in Raqqa begging for help, but is forbidden from helping her because she's removed her veil. So he says, "Oh God, a Londoner's voice, a young voice, maybe his age, Anika's age, oh, to be deaf, Allah, take away my hearing." The voice makes him remember Anika, also his mother, Isma, himself. It makes him wish to be deaf, and it prompts him to make contact with Anika via a voice call on Skype to ask for help. Karamat's own moment of self-recognition and reversal comes in two stages, both of them closely linked to Sophocles' play. Evoking Antigone's cry amid the dust storm, as reported by the guard in the play, Anika's own cry is witnessed by Karamat on his TV screen, as you can see in the first quote here. For a few moments, there was only a howling noise, the wind raging through the park, and then a hand plucked away the white cloth, and the howl was the girl. A howl deeper than a girl, a howl that came out of the earth and through her and into the office of the Home Secretary, who took a step back. The physical impact on Karamat here, the howl reaching him all the way from Karachi to London, isn't enough to make him change course, but it does suggest the beginning of his unraveling. Just a couple of pages later, the Pakistan High Commissioner tells him that their government can't intervene since support for Anika is growing. And again, Anika affects Karamat physically as he's left tasting dust on his hand. Karamat's moment of full self-recognition and reversal finally comes with his wife, Terry, who's the novel's Tiresias, not so much Eurydice, when she momentarily takes away his sight by placing her hand over his eyes, and he focuses on other senses, the smell of the rotting body, which seems to reach him from Karachi just like Anika's howl did, Terry's touch, which, I quote, made something in him stop, something else in him start, and her voice saying, be human, fix it. And then finally, the cold touch of ice that he feels on his own fingertips, like Anika touching the ice coffin. The final formal element I want to discuss different in that Shamsie's reworking of it doesn't immediately involve the sort of polyphony, contestation of voices that the tragic structures provide. This is the messenger speech, which in the play reports the suicide of Haemon over the body of Antigone. In Home Fire, its contents are communicated via the TV screen, just like the dust storm and Antigone's howl. Final scene, as I mentioned earlier, is mediated through Kosminski's Brits. While we know that Karamat is watching, everybody's watching, it isn't framed by him. Everyone instead is watching as every television channel replayed it endlessly. Some reviews of Home Fire actually criticize the theatricality here, whereby the reader is put in the position of the spectator, watching as we might watch Antigone or Brits. From this position, we can't reach the interior world of either Aemon or Anika. They're simply a man in a navy blue shirt and the woman he's come for. Rahana Ahmed has brilliantly shown how this ending maintains Anika's elusivity, undermining the surveillant gaze and denying the reader, especially the white, secular middle-class reader, knowledge of the Muslim woman at the heart of the book. But through the lack of involvement of the novel's other characters and the spectatorial perspective from which the scene is described, such an ending also directly engages us as the viewer, reader, and all the more so because this is where we're left. In the play, both the chorus and the messenger maintain a heavy silence after his speech, just before Creon's final entrance. The novel's ending literalizes that silence. As a result, as Shamsie herself has pointed out, as you can see here, there's no longer any other media or chorus to interpret this moment for us. As she says, you're forced to think beyond the moment it ends at. Go beyond that moment, be the chorus yourself. Ultimately, then, Home Fire positions its readers as a sort of chorus, urging them to add their own voices to its polyphony. So, just over 10 years ago, Edith Hall drew our attention to a group of modern novels, not just Anglophone ones, where, I quote, the question of rival subjectivities, the radically different ways in which individual subjects can experience the same events, is brought into focus through interaction with an ancient Greek tragedy. Novels like Christa Wolf's Medea and Barry Unsworth's The Songs of the Kings have heard in tragedy, I quote again, the plurality of voices, the polyphony, indeed the antiphony. Homefire, I think, belongs to such a group in its engagement with Sophocles' play. But what I've tried to show today is the close connection between its polyphony and its intermediality and its tragic form, the contestation of voices produced through its integration of multiple media and its reworking not simply of the story of Antigone, but of the structural building blocks of her tragedy. Carson's translation of Sophocles' play begins with Antigone saying, "We come out of the dark." As if responding to this opening line, Shamsie's novel makes visible and audible those typically in the dark, those denied a political voice, alongside those who have a very powerful one. In staging so many different voices in contestation with each other, Shamsie not only demonstrates the heterogeneity of the British Muslim community, but also, on a broader scale, undermines any either-or dichotomy of the sort that Heaney talks about in The Burial at Thebes. We, the readers, are invited to participate in this multitude of voices, and in this respect, tragic form does important political work. We don't know what will happen after Amon's vest explodes. We have no lament, no choral conclusion like we do in the play. We don't know if Karamat will want or if he'll be able to accomplish his plan to change citizenship laws as Theresa May did. But the final image of Anika and Amon as lovers in an embrace that Antigone and Haemon in Sophocles' tragedy have only as corpses, that final image renders us, like them, momentarily suspended. The scene's open-endedness raises the question of whether it could be otherwise, and it leaves us to answer it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Naomi. That was terrific. It was a really gripping talk. Thank you. I would love to ask questions myself, though. Please, anyone, please feel free to send in a question either through the YouTube or send an email to APGRD, because your questions will reach us that way as well. But while we perhaps wait for, can I just take you up at the very end there, that it does seem to me that there is also a difference from the tragic form of Antigone and from typical tragic form, which shows you the aftermath of the catastrophe, the aftermath of the violent turning point. And Sophocles' play, has this really protracted Creon scene at the end, whereas Karamat, as you said, you have no idea. I mean, I must say, I took it that his life was in ruins, like Creon's, that he would never recover and would abandon his political career and his marriage is over. And but it seems to me that, arguably, that Sophocles' play wrings out of Creon some kind of understanding, some kind of understanding of Creon's position of the suffering that he's brought on himself. But I'm not sure that the Shamsie novel ever, whether Karamat is as he's given some understanding, but he's never given any he's given very little in the way of redeeming features. He's fairly close to a kind of modern political villain almost, isn't he? Or am I wrong about that?
Yeah, no, I don't think you're wrong. It's certainly true that the novel just ends there, and we don't have any of the sort of extended lament and that Creon sings at the end of the play, where, as you say, you really get a sense that in some respect he's learned something, and has been completely devastated, although we don't know exactly then what how he's going to act. With the novel, I think that open-endedness is very deliberate. So we have to, as I said, we sort of have to think about how this might affect Karamat. I do wonder if you're not, I mean, like most readers, if you don't have Antigone in the back of your mind, how you would then interpret or think about Karamat at the end of the novel. I think it might be more open-ended as a result. There are, I mean, his closeness to his son has been emphasized throughout, and there are strong indications that his marriage is about to fall apart. And where Terry crosses over with Eurydice, she sort of leaves the room at very significant moments. So you do get that sense of unravel. But I still think there's a question mark left there. I guess the other thing I'd say, I think while Karamat is certainly not very likable, one thing that I think Shamsie has really caught in the play, which a lot of adaptations don't, is sort of some of the ways in Creon and Antigone, you know, they're from the same family, and they're both in fact sort of very, you know, they're very elite. While there are very strong differences between them, there are also some important ways in which their background is the same. And Shamsie communicates that through all these characters being from the British Muslim community, and they're even actually being sort of more direct points of contact between Karamat's family and that of Anika and her siblings. So there are various things that slightly muddy the sort of any sense of polar opposites, and even his political stances, while some might seem, you know, to those of us to those of us who are so politically inclined, abhorrent, they're combined actually with apparently more progressive approaches towards the community that he himself is from. So I think he's a slightly more ambiguous character perhaps than we might initially think.
Yes, it reminds me that when Nelson Mandela organized a play reading of Antigone, he himself took on the part of Creon because he felt he wanted to understand what it was that made Creon tick, rather than simply be the Antigone. So have we got questions arising?
Just a comment so far, I think.
It won the London Hellenic Prize, this novel, which is for any kind of work, including our paltry scholarly works connected to Hellenic culture. And I think quite understandably, this novel was regarded as throwing as much, if not more, light on Hellenic culture than more conventional academic work. Now, here is a new question to do with the role of the chorus. Yes, so this is to do with the spectators being called on to perform the role of the chorus. And wondering in particular whether there's an element of its relating to a post-dramatic theatre where this is a feature. That instead of the chorus being there, that you are obliged to become the chorus, Naomi.
I think for sure that could be actually thank you so much, Fiona, for that question. Yes, I think that could definitely be in play. I definitely want to make it in play because I've thought about that sort of sense of audience engagement, sort of directly looking at the spectators and sort of confronting them and making them aware of their own spectatorial gaze that can be a hallmark of quite a lot of, as Fiona puts it, post-dramatic theatre. I've thought about that in connection with ancient Greek theatre and moments when I think the audience is again confronted with their own role and made to really think about what they're doing as spectators. So then to also think about that in terms of what this novel is doing to its readers is great. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about this too. Thank you.
And I see here a question relating to Judith Butler, who of course has taken this play as a centerpiece for some of her discussion of gender, and asking, do you think that the novel has any interaction with that?
So from what I could gather, having not managed to speak to her directly, Kamila Shamsie, I don't think is directly engaging with some of the really foundational discussions of this play, going back to Hegel and Lacan, but through to Judith Butler and Bonnie Honig. That said, I do think there are aspects of Butler's approach, and also to take another feminist approach. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, Honig's one. I do think there are features there that are interesting to think about in relation to home fire. So I mentioned very briefly the currents of non-normative desire that are flowing through Sophocles' play, and Butler, amongst others, drew our attention to in particular. And I think Shamsie is very aware of that. Those feature at various points where Haemon's activities start mirroring those of Parvais, Anika's brother, when they're in the full throes of their very intense sexual relationship. And also in other contexts, so the guy who recruits Parvais, Farouk, there are moments in their encounters which also seem quite sexually charged, and indeed Anika doesn't know about Farouk, but thinks that Parvais has met a woman, and that he's thinking that he might get married, or he's having a good time with her. So anyway, so I think that side of things, you maybe could draw some connections to Butler's work, and then also just thinking of Antigone, Anika as a very strongly powerful figure. There's nothing. I don't think there's anything abject about her in Home Fire. She becomes she seems to be quite a strong political agent. So we might think about that in relation to Butler's work. And also I said Honig's work, because Honig reminds us of Ismay, whom Butler doesn't talk about very much. But I think Shamsie is really interested in Ismene. And while Isma does recede from the novel, because she began it, and she comes back into it in an exchange with Karamat that's also very powerful, I think we're really meant to think about her role too, even if it's not the same sort of co-conspiratorial role that Honig discusses in her work. Thank you very much, Shreya, for that question.
I thought you brought out very well the way that she didn't come to Antigone from a teaching or academic angle, but it was originally put in her mind by Jatinder Verma, who's very much a man of the theatre. So she was thinking about it theatrically right from the start.
I've also wondered to what extent to bring in any of the most well-known fundamental versions of Antigone, like Ennui, who Shamsie said in an interview, sort of point blank, no, I haven't read that. So I don't know to what extent to put this novel in play with the numerous, many other dramatic versions of Antigone, versus some specific ones that I think we can identify at work within the novel.
Good. Well, is there anything else Claire is looking after questions for us. Well, we're actually absolutely on the dot of 3 o'clock, or 3 o'clock our time. I think I mean, I hope other people share with me. I felt that was a fascinating talk, and I learnt a lot from it, and I greatly admire your close reading, and some of the themes it brought out. I mean, I hadn't really thought, for example, about that theme of the ice, which is fascinating. Very I mean, I think of you as a critic of Greek poetry and Greek drama as somebody with a very strong sensual approach. And you brought that same approach to the novel. Well, it was a marvelous talk, and Naomi, we very much look forward to having you in Oxford in person, where you can meet our students.
I can't wait.
And we can take you out to supper. But it's great. Thank you very much for zooming to us today. And we hope to see you again before long. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oliver.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Brilliant.